Good morning and welcome to the 26th meeting of 2025 in Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies this morning. Our first agenda item is to agree to take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Agenda item 3 is the consideration of a work programme paper. Item 4 is the consideration of a paper on the EU law tracker, and item 5 is a consideration of the evidence taken by the committee on its human rights, equalities and access to services in rural areas of Scotland inquiry this morning. Our members agreed to take these items in private. That is agreed. Thank you. Our second agenda item this morning is evidence taking on our inquiry into human rights, equalities and access to services in rural areas of Scotland. And this is our first formal evidence session on the inquiry. But last week we began our work on the inquiry with a visit to Blairgowrie, and it was a really informative and helpful visit. And it was putting us in a great position to start off today. So we'd like to thank all those who met us last Monday, and in particular I'd like to thank Perth and Kinross TSI for organising the day for us. It was very well put together. Thank you so much. So this session today will take place in a roundtable format, and I would just like to open up around the table and online for us all to introduce ourselves. So I'll go first. I'm Karen Adam, MSP for Banffshire and Buchan Coast and the convener of this committee. And I'll hand to the left. Rhoda?
Yes. Can I ask about...
Rhoda, we're just introducing ourselves.
Oh, sorry. I'm away in a dwap. I'm not awake. Rhoda Grant, Highlands and Islands Labour MSP.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm Louis Yanez. I'm the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights Lead at the Scottish Human Rights Commission.
I'm Paul McLennan. I'm the MSP for East Lothian. I was Provost Councillor in East Lothian as well, and was previously Housing Minister for a couple of years until June this year.
Tess White, MSP, North East region, and as those of you know, we've got huge rural areas in Aberdeenshire and Angus. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirsty Harding, Senior Development Officer for Policy and Membership at the Highland Third Sector Interface, based just outside Inverness.
Good morning, I'm Juliana Marao. I'm the Chief Executive Officer for Borders Community Action, the Third Sector Interface in the Scottish Borders.
Good morning everybody, Pam Gossel, member of the Scottish Parliament for the West of Scotland region.
Good morning everyone, Alan Webb, Chief Executive, Third Sector, Dumfries and Galloway.
Morning everyone, I'm Maggie Chapman, Scottish Green MSP for North East Scotland region.
Okay, thank you. And if we go now online, and we'll start at the top left and go along. Oh, they can't see who's there. It's too far away for me to see.
Hello, I'm Wendy Hand from Voluntary Action Shetland, the TSI in Shetland.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Megan McInnes. I'm a board member of Community Land Scotland and joining you from Applecross in the North West Highlands, where I'm also the development manager with the local development trust. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everybody, I'm Artemis Panna. I'm National Coordinator of Scottish Rural Action and I live on the Isle of Rassay in the Highland Council area.
Good morning, I'm Alistair Ross, the Policy and Consultations Officer for Aberdeenshire Voluntary Action, Third Sector Interface for Aberdeenshire.
Hello, I'm Sheena Stewart and I'm Chief Officer with Youth Council of Voluntary Organisations, a partner in TSI Western Isles and the current chair of TSI Western Isles.
Thank you all, and you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us this morning. So we're going to go straight into our conversation. We have some themes to explore, and the first theme is access to services, and we have a question from Rhoda Grant.
Thanks. I would like to ask, what are the biggest barriers to accessing services for people, especially health services, but other services as well? It's a big question, I know, it's why I did it. Should have maybe...
Does anyone indicate? Yes, Juliana.
In fact, access to services in the Scottish borders is a significant barrier for people. Transport in rural communities is a challenge, as we all know. Combined with the geography of the region and the spread, that poses significant barriers to participation in not only accessing services, but also in community life. It's an ongoing concern. In terms of access to services, we see a centralisation of services, expecting people to travel to a destination rather than services going to people and where they are at. And of course, with ongoing pressures in public budgets, this poses a significant higher risk of excluding people in terms of their accessibility. Particularly around older age population and people with disabilities. Even those who are lucky enough to live in transport networks, there is accessibility in terms of public access to services, less transport infrastructure where that exists, but mainly across the rural Scottish borders, most people live in settlements and villages that are out of transport routes. So if you don't own a car and if you don't have a means to get to a bus stop, which is the case for disabled and older people, that pose significant challenges. On top of that, there are costs associated with living in a rural community such as Scottish borders, and most families need to own a car. That poses additional challenges and financial pressures on people compared to urban areas. It's estimated that an additional £50 a week is the cost associated to own a vehicle compared to families living in urban areas. So this is a significant challenge for those living in rural Scottish borders, and particularly my concern is around older people and people with disabilities. There are pockets of good provisions, such as door-to-door community transport, but more infrastructure support and funding for those services needs to be considered if we're talking about equality and, using the resources available across the third sector to fill gaps where we know there are pressures in public service provision.
Thank you. We now, Alistair would like to come in on this.
Thank you. My colleague there has explained the difficulties of transport. What we're seeing in Aberdeenshire is the same across Scotland, that public services, local public services are being hollowed out, local government's being hollowed out, rural nurseries, rural schools, community hospitals, libraries, they're all being closed. So the choice is being taken away. The option of doing something local is completely taken away. So accessing services becomes impossible for some people. Car ownership in Aberdeenshire is very high for those who can afford it. Even if public transport does exist, it can be extraordinarily expensive. So, for instance, travelling from Mintlaw, which is 30 miles from Aberdeen, population of about nearly 3,000 people, it will cost more than £20 to get to Aberdeen and back in a day. So these are just some small examples of how difficult it is. But choice and options are being taken away from people.
Thank you. Sheena has indicated as well she'd like to come in.
Okay, thank you. As Julianne and Alistair have already highlighted, the issues around public transport, and certainly in, an island community like we are, the transport is definitely being eroded all the time, and community transport services that are being run, the public purse is ever decreasing, and that has an impact on third sector providers who are often the ones who are running public transport services, so they're having to cut services, which has a huge impact on access to services. But maybe I could highlight transport in terms of accessing healthcare, and I know we'll talk about healthcare later, but hospital appointments here, often people now have to travel from Uist and Barra up to Stornoway to access healthcare appointments, and certainly that can mean 200-mile round trips, and it is by plane often, and that is not fit for purpose. The flight that goes from Benbecula to Stornoway, it's a limited service and hampered by bad weather often, and that causes a lack of trust, and patients then are having to travel on the ferry, often leaving home at 6 a.m, as I said, for a 200-mile round trip. A lot of patients who are unwell, having to travel that way, often don't have their own transport and relying on taxis. So they're being picked up very early in the morning to get to a ferry that will then take an hour and another hour and a half trip on the other side in Harris up to Stornoway to the main hospital there. And maybe that could be for, a short appointment, but people are often, not really fit to be travelling that way. So we need better transport system in terms of the flights to enable us patients to get to those appointments. So that's, hampering a huge hugely. I was talking to someone who actually travelled yesterday to having an operation this morning, and they went up on a very small plane from Benbecula to Stornoway, and they needed support from someone working from Highlands and Islands Airport Limited and another cancer patient to help get her, basically she said, haul her out of the plane, which was certainly undignified to say the least. So that's the reality of the situation that we're finding ourselves in here in Euston Barra.
Thank you. Megan has indicated as well.
Thanks. Yes, I think that the Community Land Scotland and its members would very much echo what the others have already said. I wanted to say a few words about some other dimensions of this. I think, firstly, it's really clear that the results from the Scottish Human Rights Commission report about the impact rurality has on accessing economic, social and cultural rights is a real issue. It feels, for those of us living in sparsely populated areas, that we're really penalised in accessing those rights because of where we are. And we also see a real shrinkage in the delivery of public services to our communities. We've had to, here in Applecross, step in and provide a community transport service because there's no functioning other public transport service, and that has had a huge impact, positive impact on young children and young adults, particularly, who enabling them to access cultural sporting events, educational activities, which otherwise they would be completely prevented from joining. I think the other thing I wanted just to mention at this stage was the interconnectedness of all of this. So, for example, we're seeing real problems in accessing and having key workers come to communities like Applecross, provide social care services, for example, which is a huge issue at the moment. A lot of that is to do with the lack of housing, which relates to underlying issues around lack of availability of land and these kind of things. So I think that sort of interconnectedness between all of these different issues and challenges because of this sparsely populated area and the rurality is something that Community Land Scotland would really like to highlight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Kirsty?
I think everything I'm going to say echoes what all of you have said. We cover the whole of Highland, an area that obviously you know very well, and it's got a landmass the size of Belgium, and I think sometimes we underestimate the challenges that come with it, and transport is a huge issue, and the further we go in time we seem to centralise more and more on Inverness, and especially when it comes to a lot of medical services there, for example maternity services. So if you're a mum having your first child, there's a lot of kind of encouragement that you travel to Inverness to do that, and that has problems with people coming along, the partner coming along, how they get there, how expensive it is to stay there. It's an expensive place to stay in Inverness these days. There's a lot of tourism now, so Airbnbs are becoming more and more prevalent, and prices are just going up. And also just how long it takes to get anywhere. So one of the examples we often use is if you live in Durness and you want to use public transport to go south, the furthest you can get in one day is Tain. You can then stay in Tain for 20 minutes and then you have to get back on the bus to go back. and that's the furthest that you can get. Obviously, a lot of places also involve ferry rides to get to. I travelled over to Strontian last week, and that was a £12 each way on the ferry, so cost also becomes a big issue. Now, we get around a lot of it. There's loads of great community transport organisations popping up, but they depend on first funding, which is often difficult, and it's often that constant, as we know, that constant cycle of searching for it, and also the volunteers to drive these cars or these minibuses. You're then into sometimes the challenges of ages of people to get a minibus, because if you pass your test beyond 97, then you can't do it in your licence. So yeah, lots of good work happening with good people trying to help, but loads of challenges as well.
Thank you. Alan?
Yeah, thanks. I would agree with many of my colleagues, particularly on transport in Dumfries and Galloway. We've recently had a public transport review, particularly on our buses, which was designed to build more sustainability into the system for providers, but in fact has reduced the number of services. So we have even more of our villages who no longer have a bus connection at all. And some story that was widely covered in the press just a few weeks ago around the single bus service for one of our villages that takes you into town but leaves town 5 minutes after it arrives. You don't have time to do anything whilst you're there. And I think rather than repeating some of the comments that colleagues have made, I'm thinking about access and services in the way that they're integrated and that they're planned for. So we have stories, for example, of people with caring responsibilities and carers who actually give up some of the time they should be spending to go to their own health appointments or to their own appointments because the infrastructure around providing some support whilst they're absent, for example, for the person they're caring for isn't available. And the time that it takes, I suppose, overall in the system, which Kirsty's alluded to, is in an urban area, you might go to half-hour health appointment, for example, and expect to take a couple of hours out of your day, but in rural Scotland you can expect just to eliminate your whole day by the time you get there and back and all the navigating that you have to do. I suppose thinking widely on the question about access to services more broadly, not just as Juliana's mentioned there, I think around the centralisation or central provision of some services, but there is a wider question I think for us in rural areas about whether many of the things that we need to access or the support we need to be services at all, and it's an active conversation we're having in Dumfries and Galloway around the vast majority of our public sector services either have some kind of assessment process or some kind of waiting list to access, and I think that's just indicative of whether we are actually properly thinking about community responses and community response to local needs rather than just relying into expensive services all the time. If I use community transport back to the point as an example, a relatively small, in fact a tiny amount in the large, in the scale of public sector budgets locally, tens of thousands of pounds are invested into some community transport providers. Last year those providers alone provided over 1,000 health patient journeys, for example. So you're not talking about millions of pounds investment in infrastructure, you're talking about tens or even hundreds of thousands investment into communities to come up with their own solutions to do that. And at the moment it feels we're doing neither. We're not providing accessible integrated public services, nor are we providing the infrastructure to help people navigate. So we're kind of stuck in the middle. Our response in Dumfries and Galloway is the investment in communities to find their own way is actually likely the answer. We've tried redesigning public services for many years and we've not quite got there. Actually, what happens when you invest in communities to take ownership of what they want to access, how they support each other, for example, which leans less into the infrastructure and more into the place-based working. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Wendy, please.
Hi. Yeah, I think a lot's already been said and it's very similar for Shetland. I suppose from the health point of view, most services are centralised in Lerwick for the hospital, although we have the local doctors' surgeries. A lot of the hospital, a lot of the doctors' services, we can now have a lot of telephone calls, which actually can be useful for some appointments. Appointments are limited, which is quite frustrating for a lot of people, and it really depends on where you live as to access to that. A lot of our services, we have to go to Aberdeen, so we're relying for hospital appointments, which sometimes can be, a less than a half-hour appointment. As somebody says, that's your day out. You're having to fly or get the boat the night before to Aberdeen. you're then sat in the hospital for some time to get transport back to your either your flight or your boat. The appointments are not always thought about. The fact that you are flying in or coming in on the boat, so that can be an issue sometimes. You've also got with that delays or cancellations of flights, so you might end up going over for the day and being stuck for overnight, which can happen obviously with weather and technical issues or whatever it might be. You've also got people who are going over for cancer treatment, for example, who might be obviously feeling pretty bad, having to sit in an airport, waiting for flights, etc., which is really difficult. And I know they are doing more cancer treatment and things in Shetland, so it is getting better. I suppose locally, somebody mentioned about sort of that higher cost for people with having to have cars, etc. We've also got the issue of our fuel is always more expensive. Our petrol is more expensive than on the mainland, which is always something when I go over to mainland Scotland, I have a good look at how much the petrol costs are, but there's always that pence difference. So it's costing us more from that point of view. Many buses come into Lerwick first thing in the morning, so that it's made for people who work in Lerwick. They come in first thing and go out at the end, so you don't have anything else in between, which can be very difficult. We have a very ageing population, which is becoming more and more of an issue, which then has an impact on who's delivering these services. And as I think somebody else said, one of the issues being housing. So we do struggle here particularly for sort of care staff and medical staff and teaching, getting people to come here because we don't have the housing available. And the other issue we have is Yatland, our housing association, are trying to build houses, but we don't have the contractors, and we don't have the accommodation to have contractors come up. So it's a real catch-22 from that point of view. We have a lot of voluntary organisations in Shetland. I think we're one of we are the highest, I think, rated for volunteers per head of population. And that pool is limited. Lots of people wear lots of hats. People are working more, so actually being able to provide services for people during the working day is getting harder. However, I will give a couple of positives. So we are trialling at the moment. We've linked with the NHS and an RVS that have linked to. We're just trialling a service with the North Isles. So this is two ferries away to bring people to appointments. Previously, the NHS were using taxis for the whole service, which was the costs were just ridiculous. So we're working particularly with the eye clinic. We're just doing this little test, linking with transport. So the eye clinic are actually speaking to transport to arrange appointments. So it's not a case if you get an appointment, you've got a fit. So that's working well at the moment. And then we have somebody with a minibus who's going and picking people up from the North Isles. So again, it is a day away. I'm not sure how you can take an eye clinic to the Isles and how you can change that, but it's helping people to be able to access a little bit easier, and it's better on the public purse. So we're trialling that with this one service and seeing how that could potentially be expanded. The other things that we do have is we have local hubs which bring in together lots of services. So we have sessions for information, different services can go along to these hubs, and around sort of well-being as well. And they've been going for quite a few years now and seem to be working quite well. So I just thought I'd put a couple of positives in there as part of that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. We still have two other people who'd like to come in on this question, but I will say after that we'll have to move on because we still have a lot more questions and things to get through. So I'll bring in Artemis, and then after that we'll go to Lewis, and then we'll move on.
Thank you very much. And yes, Wendy, it's great to hear some of the solutions as well as some of the problems. I'm not going to repeat anything that colleagues have said, but raise a related issue, Rhoda, which is that in the healthcare system, it is not just our choice and options, as Alistair really eloquently put it, that are being taken away. It's also our access to justice. And I think the Commission's report really evidenced a damning picture of complaint systems being really hard to access and resulting in the penalisation of the complainant rather than the service provider. And I would actually add to this. So Scottish Rural Action's experience is that those issues are not the only ones with complaints and redress systems. Even more damaging, I would say, is the purposeful design of these complaints or redress systems so that they actually obscure the true nature and the prevalence of issues. So, in other words, if you get 100 complaints or concerns raised by people or organisations across different parts of rural and island Scotland relating to the same kind of service provision or the same type of product within health boards, those complaints very, very rarely get aggregated. And in fact, they're purposely kept atomised. They're treated like local problems arising from local circumstances raised by people who are, really derogatorily labelled as people with too much time on their hand. And when in fact these issues that are being raised are issues of national significance. And I think if we can address these challenges within the complaint systems, we will stop shooting ourselves in the foot, because if you're masking the nature and prevalence of a national problem, you're also masking, the solutions.
Okay, thank you. Lewis?
There's two dimensions I just wanted to pick up quickly, because I think that the question about biggest barriers can be seen at an individual level and at a structural systemic level. And we've talked a lot about that kind of individual level. So what's the biggest barrier as a rights holder accessing service? And some of that could be transport, some could, and various different, some of the different things that we've discussed. I think from that, what I just wanted to highlight is from the perspective of international human rights law, services need to be accessible, and that means both physically accessible and financially accessible. And one of the considerations that we see over and over, and the evidence we find, is that services that are free, so we think they're affordable because they're free, actually are not really affordable. And that has often to do with the physical accessibility and the policies around support of that transport. So it might be that you get a medical appointment that is free and you're well attended for, but you have to cover the cost in a way that is quite minimum compared to the actual cost around it. So what we hear evidence over and over and over is people decide, for example, not to go to the hospital because you might lose out a day of work, because you might not be able to pay the return back and forth to Inverness or to Glasgow or to Edinburgh. And so I think that's really important. We have to understand that the presumption that because we have a free set of services doesn't necessarily mean we actually have affordable services. So that's at an individual level. What I really quickly want to pick up is what is also happening at a structural level, which I think is important for the committee to reflect. And at that structural level, what we're seeing is a lack of localised policy making or flexibility in both our legislation and our policies. That means that services at times are being delivered in a way that doesn't fit the realities of what the community needs. Sometimes even the service provider, that might be the local authority or the NHS, knows that it doesn't work, wants to change that, wants to fix that, and is not able to do that because that is either a national policy to which there is no flexibility from Scottish Government, or because of a piece of legislation formulated by Parliament that doesn't allow that flexibility. And another layer of that biggest barrier in accessing services is that we have created these policies without a real human rights-based approach. So there is very little participation, there is very little input from rural communities in some of the way we deliver services. So they don't work. Communities knew they weren't going to work. The result, of course, is that at the end of the day, they don't, because there's been very little input from actual rural communities that know best at the end of the day what will serve them better and what will work for their own context.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move on to a question from Tess White, please.
Thank you. I found that very interesting, so thank you. I'd like to ask the panel, don't know who'd like to speak first, about GP services, and has access to a GP got better or worse over the last 10 years? So I don't know who would like to go first.
If there's any indications, you can come in.
I know Juliana's nodding there,
Yeah.
so I don't know if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, okay, that's fine. It's a hard question, and I think what we are seeing, we go back to that centralisation of the medical model, moving away from local communities. It's true, across the Scottish borders over the past 10 years, we have seen those local GPs that were well known, they were embedded in communities and new neighbourhoods, disappearing, and some closing, some combining. So in essence, that local model is getting less and less, it's less and less available for people in communities. In the Scottish borders, for example, we are an ageing population. I know this is in line with the trend across Scotland, but in the Scottish borders specifically, it's estimated that the region is 10 to 20 years above the average of ageing. This poses significant risks for those who are prone to need support. I think going back to Dr. Ewing's point, with the lack of those local provisions in communities, we are seeing crisis, what could be prevented becoming crisis, and therefore then more need for acute services as part of a central model, rather than the preventive approach that could have been picked up by the local GP. We understand the pressures in services and the need to think of different models. Equally, we need to think different ways of delivery where communities are at the heart of those decisions, and look at policies that will enable local authorities, the national health, to think about how the levers in the system allows for flexibility, because the current model is a model that's a downstream intervention and not upstream, and therefore year after year, with the ageing population, for example, in the Scottish borders, we'll be looking at cutting services because we're not meeting the demand, unless we start thinking strategically in preventive models at the local-based communities. My colleague Alan mentioned the value of the third sector in prevention and early intervention. That's the kind of solutions that could be part of the fabric of those discussions, but that requires strategic thinking, completely co-design of services with communities and the third sector at the heart of it, paying attention to really good models. We've seen a few here already in this room that can prevent and work as a buffer before the clinical medical model is needed. So I think, well, I don't know if I have the full answer to your question. Of course, we have seen over the years a reduction and, closures of medical and GP practices, but with that needs to come further thinking and innovation around how those communities can continue to be served in ways that meet their needs, and not through that firefighting, model, but preventative and early intervention, working alongside the third sector as part of that solution.
Thank you. You've basically confirmed what the BMA are saying, that there's a sustainability crisis in GP services and practices. Would anybody else like to pick up? I don't know if convener back.
Yeah, Wendy's indicated.
Wendy,
and Alan. Wendy's online.
Yeah.
Great, Wendy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I will say yes. They're less accessible. There's less appointments available, or that feeling of, over the last 10 years. However, some of them are providing more services. So I know my local service has, they do some physio and they do some counselling at a local level, which is really useful. I mentioned earlier as well around the use of telephone more often. So you're getting an appointment, but you may not be getting a face-to-face, but not everything does need a face-to-face. There is the use of I can't remember what they call it, but the online service. So our doctors have from 7 o'clock in the morning, you can go online and say what your issue is.
Consult, Wendy, e-consult.
Something like that, yeah. So you go on and you put on what your issue is, and they can then get back to you if needed. But the time slot for that is very tight. So if you're not up at 7 o'clock and online, you've had it. So that can be quite tight. The other issue we have is we do have a lot of locums here. So you've got that issue of you're not seeing the same person always at the surgery, and then you've got to explain yourself over and over, which obviously can get quite frustrating with things. So that can be an issue. I suppose the other thing as well is we have a lot of temporary workers up here from the oil and different things that are going on. So that obviously that has another strain on potentially on the health services. I think more the hospital in A&E. We have a lot of cruise ships come in, and they can bring with them a lot of issues. I'm hearing recently of people coming off the cruise ships and straight to A&E. So that's another sort of strain that's coming along as well. I think that's it at the moment.
Okay. Alan?
Alan?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I would agree with you, I think, on the comment around sustainability. I think that is a worry. In Dumfries and Galloway, it's certainly a patchwork. Around more populated areas, I think you'll wait longer to see a GP, for example. But I do know in my area that if I was to call my GP today, for example, I would be speaking to the GP within a few hours. And if I needed to be seen, I'm likely there this afternoon or tomorrow. So there are good services and good GP and general medical services, I think, available. But I think the consistency and equity of that across Scotland, and then the access, particularly in populated areas, I think is quite difficult. And in Dumfries and Galloway, again, we are seeing examples of surgeries closing, so GPs kind of retiring and leaving, and actually that creates an increased demand for the local board in terms of the pressure it places on them to manage those practices and trying to find others to access. But I think there is a question about GPs and training GPs and where GPs need to be based, but I think there are great examples across Scotland around how we tackle the demand. I think we've got quite a traditional kind of health system that's been around for a while that responds to need. But we've seen a lot of examples of kind of multidisciplinary models. So the example again in Dumfries and Galloway around some home visits for regular checks, for example, for people are conducted by paramedics rather than demands on GPs' time. Paramedics then report their findings into GPs, who then still are in control and making decisions about the care. But I suppose it's building those relationships and trust with the public around you don't always need to see the GP. The GP is not always the best person in terms of addressing your particular need. And I think there is an issue around us building confidence, what I call health confidence, which is knowing yourself, knowing what's good for you and good and is not quite right for you, and then where best you can access the right care. And I think the traditional system of going into primary care, into GP and then being referred out, it doesn't really fit for, I think, the complex health needs that we have across, particularly in our rural communities. So there are examples of where it's working well. I'm probably less inclined to say the answer is just more GPs. I think there needs to be a genuine look at an accessible health system, and a rebuilding, I think, is also needed, certainly post-pandemic, about health confidence around actually there's some great access to online resources, for example, at NHS Inform and elsewhere that doesn't mean to say you need to have a demand in the service necessarily. But I think, to respond to your question directly, sustainability, I think, is an issue largely caused by quite a traditional linear system of how you access healthcare, which I don't think is what meets our needs.
Thank you. I think Wendy's point as well, and your point in terms of looking at the systemic model, but also this point about where you've got a peak of workers, additional workers, and she mentioned the cruise ships, holiday makers, particularly around the summer month. That's not factored in. So thank you for that. Shall I go to my next question?
Artemis would like to come in on this.
Okay, great. Artemis.
I think Wendy it stole my thunder in terms of that kind of seasonal fluctuation of demand on GP surgeries. But I just want to draw your attention to an excellent campaign that took place in Ireland in 2016 to 2018, and that was called No Doctor, No Village. And that was incredibly successful, not just in Ireland, of raising awareness of the vitality of these healthcare services, but it also kind of influenced the way that Scotland thinks about it. And one of the good things that have resulted out of that, and also out of that kind of lived expertise of rural communities, is the need not necessarily for more GPs, but for more generalism in healthcare services. So at the moment, what you're seeing is a lot of medical professionals being pushed down that ultra-specialism path. And actually, that is not what rural and island communities need. We need good generalists, we need good GPs, we need good senior nurse practitioners who basically can do a lot of different things and are enjoying the work they do and can live, you know, a good life where they choose to live.
Great. Can I go on to my next question? My next question is around ambulance waiting times for rural areas, which is a huge issue in parts of Aberdeenshire, I know. So, does anybody have any views on the ambulance waiting times for rural areas? Is it getting better or worse? So, who would like to go first?
Any indications? Got no indications.
No indication apart from Juliana. Are you? So I'm sorry, I'm pointing only because you're in the room. There's nobody online. So if you, I saw you nod your head there again. So do you have a comment on that?
Actually, he's indicated.
Who? Sorry, convener.
Alistair.
Oh, great.
Thanks. I don't know whether it's getting better or worse, but we hear some horror stories in Aberdeenshire for sure. We spoke about I spoke about transport, and a few people spoke about transport, but what if you need it in an absolute emergency and no one comes? You know, we have heard of very long waiting times in Aberdeenshire, and those communities who are furthest away from accident and emergency service, so Braemar is a good example, which is often talked about, you know, a community that's fending for itself in emergency times. So, yeah, I don't know whether it's getting better or worse, but it's certainly a huge issue and a huge concern for people. I've heard quite a few times people saying, just don't get ill. Minor injury units in Aberdeenshire have closed as well. So even if you have something that's not life-threatening, you're facing huge distances and a huge amount of time to get, say, stitches or something like that where you might have been able to access it more locally up until the last few years. Hope that's helpful.
That's really helpful, and I know we're going to get a submission to the committee from Aberdeenshire from one of the councillors and through the IJB. Juliana.
Yeah, sure thing. It made me think about my own experience historically. I'm a volunteer Coast Guard, and in terms of emergency services around the coast, what we have seen in terms of good models is a multidisciplinary interagency approach. Just over there, I think that only yesterday actually, there was a situation in Peebles, the mountain bike trail, and it was volunteers from the mountain rescue that supported the initial immediate response, then allowing time for the paramedics and the ambulance to arrive. The person was airlifted to the hospital. So what we are seeing is good models where organizations are working alongside emergency care, but also volunteers and in the community, mountain rescue, water rescue, Coast Guard, lifeboat, and fire services, absolutely. So good models are there in communities. I think for me, my point is to highlight the significant value and effort from volunteers in that piece of work. We have, of course, we have to be careful that volunteers need to be respected for the time that they they offer to communities, but there are good models in terms of that multidisciplinary approach. And when resourced well and supported, those interventions can be part of the response to significant challenges and pressures in public service delivery. So we are seeing, in answer to a question, really good models out there that supports. Resilient teams is another one where people are trained to be that first respondents, particularly in rural, very isolated communities that will allow ambulance services, for example, to get to that individual in time.
That's really helpful.
So we haven't found sufficient evidence to say quite in absolute terms if it's getting worse or not. But there are two things I think are important that we have found in our work at the SHRC. One, that what is clear from our evidence is that we don't have enough during specific times of the year, and that comes back to Wendy and Artemis's points of the influx of tourism during summer months. So, and that it's not just ambulance, it's a wide range of services that have been designed for the amount of the population, but not for Shetland receiving 9,000 persons in a single day in 2 cruise ships, for example. So there's no capacity to respond to that. And so that has a big strain on the general responsiveness of ambulance and other services. So that's one thing that the service has not been tailored enough. There isn't an increase of ambulance services during the summer months, for example. And the second aspect is in relation to ambulance cars, where there's already strong commitments. For example, where in Sutherland, because of lack of connectivity, you might be able to get an ambulance car for a non-emergency appointment. And that's quite clear from NHS Highland guidelines. However, if you were to call the call centre to get that, they would usually deny it because they don't understand that that is actually the policy commitment. So there is oftentimes frustration between what has been agreed of the institution and actually at times the lack of training of the frontline person to be able to deliver the service in a way that has been agreed for the rural community. So that is often a tension in relation to how much advancements are not really operationalised on a day-to-day because people are not trained enough to respond to rural needs.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Back to you, Convener.
Thank you. We now have a question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel, and thank you for all the information you've provided so far. My question is around housing shortages, and we know it's a significant issue in rural communities. We know the best way to combat these shortages is to build new homes, but year after year we see that the Scottish Government falls short of what is needed to tackle growing homelessness, with the latest statistics showing house building completions being down around 6% from the previous year. Of course, our rural communities face unique challenges that we don't normally sometimes see in urban areas, such as lack of infrastructure, logistical hurdles and complex planning and affordability issues. At the same time, many of the homes in rural areas are old, poorly insulated and therefore prone to damp, mould and expensive heating costs. And sometimes when you look at it, it's little wonder that there is rural depopulation. There's a rural depopulation crisis, in these areas. So what do you think that the Scottish Government should be doing better to ensure that rural communities are no longer overlooked, and when it especially comes down to housing? So who would like to answer that question?
Alan would like to come in.
Alan?
Great, thanks for the question. Probably a couple of angles. Firstly, in terms of building, absolutely agree that it is a challenge to get the volume that's needed. There are some hurdles, I think, to get over around planning and so on. But I think we've got a real-life example as well, most recently in Dumfries and Galloway, one of the social landlords who had committed to house building no longer able to do that, and that presents a real challenge in terms of the sustainability. I think by the time you put together a long-term strategic plan for housing, there are so many aspects that need to come to play, but by the time it comes to delivery, the world has changed, and that's a perfect example of a commitment that can no longer be delivered. There are also the practical issues, I suppose, about where homes are, and as you mentioned, the infrastructure. So there's in preparation for today, there's a real story that was shared with me around a mum with her young children waiting for housing, and actually the only available home being in a rural village. So she's now been moved out with her family because the priority is to be housed, but she has no easy access to any of the childcare, any of the services, any of the training she needs to get to work, and therefore even when we're addressing some of the housing issues around finding homes for people that are not building, but finding homes for people in the current situation, that there is a lack of structure built around where people are housed, and no thought, I would imagine, into that process, certainly by the system, the way the system operates, around about housing a mum with young children in a rural village, for example, how she's expected to access schooling and everything else and get her children to where they need to be. So I think that really is a challenge. And I think to your main point, depopulation, we talk about a lot. I certainly have a view that tackling kind of repopulating our rural areas is one of the overarching commitments that we'll need to have that will help us drive some of the other levers, including housing and health and community-based responses. Because I think unless we're committed to repopulating our rural communities, we are only ever going to manage the decline based on forecasting services and infrastructure around declining population. So I think certainly in Dumfries and Galloway we have a housing plan and a combined strategy which looks good. I think nobody thinks it's going fast enough, and I think whilst we need greater investment, I think, into local infrastructure, particularly in our area, around the social landlords, not just big commercial house builders, but social landlords being supported to be able to build homes in the places we need. We also need to understand, when we're addressing homelessness and housing issues, about the infrastructure that's needed around where we're placing people. Otherwise, we've literally, in that example, moved a family to be even more isolated than they were before, even though they have a roof over their head. So we've fixed one issue and created 5 more, for example.
Thank you for that information, Alan. One of the things I worked on when I was on the Committee for Local Government, I worked on some work around speaking to local authorities, and one of the things that they said stops developers really house building basically in these rural areas, especially when there's ferries going back and forward, is the costs and the planning, and especially somebody building a house in an urban area, the accessibility to get those materials there it's quite good, but obviously getting it on ferries and getting it across is a lot more harder. So how do you see that the government can incentivise probably house builders more as well? But also I want to touch back on what you've said in relation to housing isn't on its own. We've got to see the full infrastructure. So what could the government do better? Because our committee looks at these kind of budgets and sees that are all departments covering, whether it's to do with quality or other areas. So how do you think that they could work better as well?
I think if that's directed at me, I'm going to say, first of all, housing's not my specialist area. So what I would say, though, is I think particularly given the plan we have and the housing plan we have in Dumfries and Galloway and the leaning into social landlords, that's where the support I would suggest is needed, and I hope my colleagues would agree with me, around we aren't going to ever be in an area that we're attractive to big commercial house buildings, because the developments are never going to be like that. So we're never going to have the volume of the capacity or the that you might have in a particular urban area. So I think investment in those smaller builders and understanding that the costs are higher to build, the infrastructure is more expensive to put in place, but in the long term it's an investment into this repopulation that we talked about. There's another aspect that I didn't cover on your other point, which is around more older homes and the cost of fuel and heating those homes. We have pretty successful, I would say, but unfortunately very small scale third sector partnership responses to helping people with heating their homes, finding the right and more cost effective ways to heat their home, but also in things like insulating their homes and finding those techniques to keeping the heat in their homes, for example. But again, our approach to those are very small investment projects, tests and trials of tens of thousands of pounds. Actually, what we could be doing in Dumfries and Galloway is an investment of a few £100,000 and roll that across the board, which means it's cheaper for people in the homes they're in before we even look to the homes that we need to build as well. So I didn't want to miss commenting on that as well. But yeah, I think a recognition that in rural areas you're not going to get the economies of scale in house building, so we need investment in some of those smaller developments. developments and the infrastructure around that.
Thank you, Alan.
Well, quite a bit of interest in this
Yes,
question. We have Megan would like to come next.
Thanks, convener. Yeah, and I'd like to thank the member for this question. I think it's a really, really critical area where communities in rural areas are really facing major struggles. From Community Land Scotland's perspective, we see our members, community land owners, stepping in to play a really key role in providing affordable homes in rural areas. It's a good example of the way in which community landowners are stepping in to provide greater access to economic, social and cultural rights across the board. The reason for this, as Alan's already said, is that not only in rural areas in the Highlands and Islands, not only do you not have large-scale housing developers meeting the need for affordable homes, you also do not have registered social landlords providing those homes. So the burden of delivering affordable homes is very much falling on the shoulders of community landowners and local development trusts. There's some really interesting research that's been published about this from the Scottish Land Commission's work on rural housing, if the committee would like to look at that. I think from Community Land Scotland would very much agree with the recommendations, with the conclusions of the Human Rights Commission's report. And certainly from my own experience in Applecross, the challenges around security of tenure, affordability, habitability, fuel poverty and location are all ones which are contributing to an affordable housing crisis in Applecross and across the west coast of the Highlands and also Skye and the Islands areas. In our particular area, for example, we've got 50% of the housing stock are short-term lets and social housing. And a recent housing needs assessment that was done here showed that 15% of the respondents to our housing needs survey said they were considering leaving the area due to the lack of available affordable homes. That's double the proportion of the local community than when we previously surveyed this. And I think this is a really good example of the fact that affordable housing isn't really just about the lack of homes, it's about the very viability of rural communities. Because if you don't stem that depopulation trend, then there won't be enough working age adults to be able to support the continued provision of social care and all the other access to public services which the ageing demographics in these communities will need in the future. And I think the other question in terms of location is really critical across Highland area in particular. It's we see it from rural communities in the reverse of what Alan has described, where the homes that are being built in and around population centres already. So Portree, Ullapool, Inverness, there are not affordable homes being delivered at scale in the way that are needed in the local areas. So in terms of your question of what the government can do to address this and what recommendations the committee can make, I think we would support what was in the Human Rights Commission's recommendations, but there's a bit too much focus in there in the government's existing action plans, which frankly haven't yet led to any significant change on the ground. And I'd like to draw the attention of the committee to some well-documented work across other sectors, particularly around the community-led housing sector, about what's needed to help community groups themselves step up and deliver affordable homes in the areas where those homes are needed. There's work needed, for example, around the availability of land. If you don't have the land, you can't build the houses, both in terms of immediate access to land, but also connecting this conversation with the wider discussion around the border land reform agenda and the need to tackle the increasing concentration of land ownership in rural areas, which is preventing the building of land. The second part of this is, as already has been raised, the question of the cost per unit build for affordable housing, which is becoming it's a really significant challenge. It's something we're dealing with right now in Applecross in our project to try and deliver affordable homes, but it's something that's recognised across the sector. And I think one of the key discussions and key areas where the government could intervene more would be committing to extending and increasing the funding that's available for community groups through the Rural and Ireland Housing Fund, but also providing community groups with greater support to navigate planning processes, which have become increasingly difficult through following the National Planning Framework 4. there was a recently launched community-led housing alliance, which is bringing together the views of community-led housing groups from across Scotland, in terms of thinking about what they see as needed from their perspective as the deliverers of affordable homes across rural areas. And I think the final part of the puzzle from our perspective is not just thinking about the duty bearers who are responsible for delivering the improving access to the right to housing, not just thinking of them in terms of local authorities or even registered social landlords, but looking at other non-state actors, for example, large-scale landowners in rural areas who have the land but are not stepping up yet to deliver affordable housing on that land and ensure the viability of these rural communities. Again, connecting to the wider land reform discussions and debates, the committee could look at what is in the land rights and responsibilities statement, which talks about the fact that if you own land, it doesn't give you just rights, it also gives you responsibilities, and those responsibilities need to extend to doing what you can as a landowner to deliver and help support wider access to economic, social and cultural rights, including the right to housing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just to note, we'll have a little bit more interest in this question, but we're going to have to ask everyone who can be a bit more succinct, because we're running out of time and we've got quite a bit to get through as well. So apologies, I don't want to stifle any discussion. It's been really great and really helpful, but if we could just be mindful of the time. Thank you so much. So we're going to go to Sheena and then Alistair.
Okay, thank you. I'm trying to be very brief. As Megan, was highlighting, it's not just about building new houses. There's definitely a need for that, but it's about making the housing that's there already fit for purpose. In island communities like our own community here, many of the houses were built pre-1980s, so many of them don't have insulation. And so that means that they're, very hard to heat, and there are some grants there for putting insulation in, but it often means testing, and many people can't access those grants. So it means that when the heating source is switched off, houses get cold very, very quickly, and families are spending much of their salaries pension on heating. The recent 2024 Affordable Warmth at Home in the Western Isles report commissioned by TIG, Taoiseach Gow, found that over 80% of the houses in the Western Isles spend more than 10% of their income on heating, with 50% of households spending 20% of their income on heating homes. When this really, we see that we in the Western Isles face, some of the highest levels of fuel poverty in Scotland, and so it's looking at ways that there are grants there help to make those houses fit for purpose, and just highlighting some of the costs on fuel. Like a lot of the houses here in Uist and across the Western Isles, they're oil central heating, and we are paying 81.5 pence per litre, for domestic heating, and that's compared to the Scottish average of around 61 pence. So, and many people then got rid of other heating sources when there was grants available in the 1890s and put oil central heating in, because at that time it was something like 17 pence per litre. So it just shows how things have changed, but also in terms of investment in more affordable housing in rural areas of the Western Isles, because there is an issue with depopulation as in many other areas, and so I think in terms of, you were asking about what the Scottish Government may be able to do, there's obviously the Social Housing Investment Programme, the SHIP programme, and monies for that programme, that social housing, is spent north on the outskirts of large towns like Stornoway, for example, because it's cheaper to build houses there, whereas very little of that money is now being spent. The further south you go, the higher the cost to build houses are. So so I think there needs to be more flexibility in terms of how the SHIP money can be spent, so that it's more bespoke in terms of what the needs are in different communities, depending on how rural you are. Other things, very briefly, I think an uplift in Croft House grants, but not everyone wants, or say social housing. So it's the uplift in Croft House grants, self-build loans, etc. Because since COVID, the cost of building has rocketed, especially in the more rural areas again. So a lot of families just can't afford to build houses now. So there needs to be help in things like shared equity, rent to buy. There needs to be more investment in that because if not, we're looking at, already we've got a crisis in care. As it is, because we are trying to keep families and attract new families in, people of working age, because the population is definitely, in terms of the retired pension population, we've got 25.2%, and that's looking to raise to 28.8 by 2032. So there's a lot of things there. I am aware that I want to allow other people to come in, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alistair and then Wendy, please.
Thank you. I wanted to make a quick point about the affordable housing contributions that are required of developers, because what local authorities prefer is a neatly packaged on-site affordable home delivery, and that's not always what's appropriate in rural communities. Certainly what we find in Aberdeenshire is that often new housing developments are not close to town centres or other services or transport links, and therefore affordable housing is built in an area where people who are then housed there can't live the life that they would want. An example near where I live is affordable housing being built beside £500,000 houses designed for car users, because it's on a road with no pavement and no streetlights and no bus. So I think if there was some more creativity and some more flexibility in consultation with communities, so being communities' voices being at the heart of it, that the affordable housing contributions could be used in a more effective way. But it has to be creative, and communities have to be at the heart of how that's done.
Thank you. Wendy, then Lewis.
Hi. So some issues have already been covered. I'll try and bullet point. So planning issues can be a nightmare. Our planning department not fit for purpose, I'm going to say. I might be speaking out of turn, but you get different things from different people, so it's very difficult. I've already mentioned the issues with getting contractors up here. The increase in cost of materials is constantly an issue. I think somebody mentioned about that assumption that there is an assumption you have to be on benefits to get, or you do have to be on benefits to get some of the insulation, windows, etc. I'm not sure that is always the case, but people are not aware of that. So those on lower incomes, but not on benefits, and not always benefiting from that. If you can get the funding for that, we have very limited contractors who can install the insulation, windows, or heating, etc. So that can be an absolute nightmare to get somebody actually to quote for you in the first place. Local housing association, I think I mentioned, they've been building some houses. They've had to reduce the amount of houses they're going to build, partly because of cost, but again because the contracts are too big for a lot of the contractors locally, and for bringing people up. Certainly the increase in tourism has affected private rental. For example, you can get for a week what you could get for a month if it was a private rental, if it's that seasonal thing. And I have heard of people who have had 6 months contract, and then they're basically kicked out for 6 months while they can be get the seasonal money, and then it's available again over the winter months, which is totally out of order. Young people are leaving and not coming back, and I can say that personally. My daughter is won't live in Shetland because she cannot afford to buy a house, cannot afford the local rents, which are absolutely ridiculous, and she's a teacher, so we're going to lose her. That's evident. I think Megan mentioned, we've got that ageing population and the youngsters are not coming back, so that is going to be an issue at some point. And one of the issues for the younger people in particular, and I can say that my daughter and my son, the issues with buying houses, the system in Scotland of offers over when you're buying a property is absolutely ridiculous. We've had evidence here since COVID of people paying 100,000 over the asking price. Youngsters have got absolutely no chance, and actually it's not relative to the cost of the house, and they can't get a mortgage for that. They can't get a mortgage for that part. They're having to save up for the deposit and extra, and go in this lottery of you may get or you may not, which is an absolute nightmare. I couldn't believe it when I moved up to Scotland, actually. So that system is an absolute nightmare, and because of that, we are having more older people who have that disposable income buying the properties from out with Shetland and moving to Shetland, which is then increasing our ageing population. So it is having a detrimental effect from that point of view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and then we'll go to Paul for his question.
Thank you.
Just after Luce, Paul.
All right.
So I just pick up a couple of things really quickly that kind of differ or adds to what we've heard from other colleagues. In our Highlands and Islands report, we have a quote that says, "There isn't a rural housing crisis. There are many different rural housing crises." And I think that's really important for the committee to understand and acknowledge, because the situation is not the same across Scotland. So rural Scotland and urban Scotland is not the same, but rural Scotland is also not the same. And so the problems in Shetland that have been identified by Wendy, for example, where you have a housing association with the money to build, but not the workers to build, is very different from the issues in the Outer Hebrides, or is very different in Caithness, or is very different in the Borders or the Highlands. And so the policy response and the legislative response cannot be the same, not just for urban versus rural, but across the country. It has to have a very divergent way of addressing it. And we also need, I think if there is a serious commitment for rural housing, we need a substantially bolder approach that rethinks some of the way we construct, some of the way we do our planning. When I speak to some of my colleagues in national human rights institutions in Norway and Sweden and Finland, one of the things I'm told is we don't know how to build in rural areas. I don't know enough about architecturally or planning, but there is mechanisms in how we require houses to be built in Edinburgh in the same way that to be built in Barra. And the contexts are very different. So the cost for the housing, the way that the housing is actually fit for the purpose, it is thought at a national level, and it's not, and it shouldn't be. And so that's one of the real big, I think, tensions. If we're very seriously committed about building more, we also have to build differently, and we have to rethink our planning and other procurement legislation. And the final thing that we haven't picked up, but I think it's really important to discuss in the context of housing, is our very serious problem of rooflessness, so lack or extreme homelessness, people with no temporary accommodation being provided, local authorities denying the provision of temporary accommodation. And I think what happens in rural Scotland is often invisibilised by the fact that we don't see rough sleeping in the same way that we might see in urban centres. But that is often the fact that because people are sofa surfing, so someone's allowed them to sleep in their home, someone has allowed them to sleep in a camper van or in a camping port, etc. And so we think there isn't rough sleeping. We think there isn't people with no temporary accommodation, and there is, and it is quite significant. So if we are serious about meeting our human rights obligations and our minimum core obligations, we have to start there. If we're going to solve some of the issues in housing, we have to start with the people that have no accommodation whatsoever currently living in rural Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Now go to Paul, please.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. I mean, I was going to ask obviously some of the questions on housing, but I think you've answered that. I think that's something that we need to discuss carefully. But the point Lewis mentioned, I think, about having localised solutions is incredibly important. The Rural Housing Action Plan looked at that, but it's not one size fits all, even in different parts of rural Scotland, and I think that's really clear. There was a couple of questions I wanted to ask, and we were in Blairgowrie last week, and there's a couple of key things that kind of came through for me. One was obviously about the cost of living, so I'll ask generally about the cost of living. But two was kind of almost looking at solutions to this, and in terms of, for me, it was about delivery and how do we deliver services. So is the council best, and I think, Juliana, you talked around about this having a multi-agency approach. Who's best to deliver these services? Is it national government setting the policy framework? Is it local government almost doing what it does? Or is it best leaving it to local services with a multi-agency approach? And that's one of the key questions for me, is how do we best deliver these services? And one of the issues they had last week was talking about capacity building. Is there enough? And this will be a discussion I think you hear in all the TSIs in terms of this. Do we have enough capacity in our communities to deliver these services that need to be there? So the first question would be to everyone is, who's best to deliver the services? And is there enough flexibility within the system just now? I've often found, in my own experience, being councillor and in speaking to organisations, the local community is the best people to deliver the services. But one, do they have the capacity, and two, do they have the funding to do that? And I think we need a change in the way we deliver services in rural Scotland in terms of building that capacity. So I'd be really keen, because if we're going to look at after, what we've heard from you today is, what do we then do on the back of that? And one of the key things for me is, how do we support local communities to do that? How do we fund them, but how do we build capacity as well? So Juliana, I'll probably come to yourself as well, because you talked about the multi-agency kind of approach, but that's a key fundamental for me, is who's best at delivering services and how can we support that?
Juliana?
Thank you, and I actually really welcome this conversation, and I think for us across the third sector, it's not a one or the other. It's about that patchwork that makes the fabric of what communities are about. I think having the seat at this table today is really important, but in terms of funding and service delivery, the third sector needs to be at that table to have those conversations, and I think there needs to be a serious conversation about the redesign, and Alan, my colleague, often mentions reimagining how service should be delivered, but with communities at the heart of that decision-making. Some absolutely activities and services are best placed at that local level in communities, supporting gaps where that exists, needs resourced, needs that decision-making approach, but others are, public duty. So how can we come together as a wider partnership to look at local solutions in a way that prevents services diminishing or ceasing altogether because of public pressures, but looking at the money that's already flowing? That is money flowing in the system. We're not talking about best use of that money. We need to be serious about how community wealth building, for example, can be applied in communities. We need to be serious about how even contracts across the public authorities can support some of the initiatives led by communities. And looking at capacity building is also about looking at the third sector as a key player and building their capacity to be that key player. I think I'm talking really high level here, but that high level conversation needs to happen. And it's not looking at the third sector or interfaces or organizations for feedback when decisions have already been made, but ask the questions when questions are being asked. Exactly what you're saying. How can we do differently? Who is best in leading on what? And often, I think from us in the third sector is about tapping into where we can add value. We mentioned community transport, for example. Absolutely a clear need for community transport, less cost in running those provisions, and potentially employment, hyper-local employment in communities, and door-to-door transport that no big transport provider will provide and will be part of the hyper-local solution. Is that the one-off solution? No. There will still be needed investment in public delivery of transport, but it's one-off. And I think until we don't look at the nuances across the landscape and where services can be delivered in partnership, we're not going to have the right answer because it's very silent at the moment. I will probably hold because I'm aware of the time and I know that my colleagues will bring more to this conversation.
I think that's a really good point. And I suppose just I know we're going to open it to the floor. One of the key things for me is Scotland and the UK are probably the most centralised governments we've got in Europe. They're far too centralised in terms of that. Even our local authorities are much bigger than municipalities in other parts of Europe. So is there lessons to be learned in terms of this about how we deliver services? And for me, it's around about how do we localise these services as best as possible. So again, that's a key thing I think for me as well for us to look at. So Camille, I don't know who else wants to come in on that point, but that's a key thing.
We have Alan, then Megan.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I could probably talk for an hour on this, but I know you'll cut me off after a couple of minutes. I think it's a really good question to pose. Perhaps if I can just kind of two fundamental areas for me, I think, of why we've got to where we've got to in this centralisation view. I think for a long time we've confused public service with public sector, and when we're looking at public services responding to what people need, we just put the money into the public sector and hope somehow, some way that it will get to where it needs. And in ongoing conversations with the Minister for Public Finance, we talk about that quite a lot, about how much goes in at the top and what at the bottom gets out into communities, for example. And there's a second situation, I think, that's presented on the ongoing financial situation in our public sector, trying to hold on to these services that we've created that might not be needed. And in fact, what happens is they become quite extractive. They take out of communities in order to maintain the system we've built. And in fact, we need to let go. So this idea of reimagining, as Juliana says, is our new language in Dumfries and Galloway, around reimagining public service, not reform. Too late for reform. We should have done that at Christie 14 years ago, or even in out of the pandemic 4 or 5 years ago. We had a choice there to renew and do something different. Instead, we did recovery, going back to where we were before, and it wasn't great before. So in terms of, to respond to your question, yeah, I think there's two significant ways that the government can influence this. One is our call for direct investment in communities. So where the government intends communities to be stronger, they shouldn't default into investing the money in public sector. They should look at where best that money can get directly into communities to take that ownership and that action. Secondly, in Dumfries and Galloway, and this is a great opportunity for me to plug, we've built what we think is a model around community-based infrastructure, particularly around the community and voluntary sector. We've taken learning from what's happened across the UK, both in terms of community responsiveness, public service reform in various ways, and different models for over a decade that have operated to create our model. And our concept is called the DG Collective, which is essentially a structure through which we can get the communities to start to collaborate to identify what it is they need, what's strong about what they have, and therefore where the public sector can complement the strength rather than limit what's available based on a service model. So the two areas we think is we need a kind of infrastructure. My view is we're starting to build that. It needs investment to create the capacity, to your point, but we do seriously need to change the mindset. If we want communities to start to take the lead, to take ownership, to do this place-based working genuinely, we need to stop defaulting into funding the systems we already have and make the money flow in a different way. Again, I think there's lots of opportunities to do that. In Dumfries and Galloway, we've established the model. The bit we're lacking is the investment. And I think we just need to be brave enough to step off, try it out. It can only be better than what we currently have, which is this kind of extractive community model, which I think causes us real concern. So hopefully that was concise enough. Can be really helpful.
Thank you. We have Megan.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think this is a really key question. So thank you for Paul, for raising this area. I would completely agree with what Alan has just said about increased resources being needed to be made available to local groups, whether that's development trusts, community landowners, or other third sector groups working at the local level. But it's not just about the funding that they can receive. It's also about looking at what border support they need and how to reduce some of the barriers that exist that are actually preventing those groups from being able to be fully delivering these kind of public services at the local level. We also need to recognise that many of these groups are run heavily or dependent heavily on volunteers, and you can't expect volunteers to be delivering these public services. They need to be properly paid for and resourced at the local level. And then I think that gets to that wider question on sort of localisation, and it's hard to have this conversation without reminding everyone again that Highland Region is the same size as Belgium. There's a clear problem here in terms of the fact that we are, even within our decentralised system, we are strongly centralising, and it cannot be efficient to be delivering public services at the local level across regions of that scale. Another element of this is there's the question of budgeting, because at the moment budgets are allocated on a per capita basis. That doesn't take account of populations in rurally sparsely populated and rural areas. And is there another way in which budgets can be allocated that can take account of the rurality and increasing costs factors, both for everybody involved in trying to deliver these public services? The other thing I wanted to raise, which goes back to something I said in an earlier answer, is looking beyond simply local authorities and multi-agencies in a traditional sense, but looking at some of the other non-state actors who are playing a critical role currently in rural areas. For example, you've got private sector companies who are significant owners of land, and Scotland has committed to make sure that we are owning and managing land in a way which is delivering public good. And what does that mean, therefore, in terms of making sure that rural communities are able to be accessing and benefiting from the public good that's derived from that land? We've also got a parallel discussion taking place across much of Scotland around community benefit and what community benefits are generated and derived for local communities from all the different large-scale investments we're seeing coming in, particularly across rural areas of Scotland. We know from the discussions that are taking place that those community benefits are not simply financial benefits. There are a whole range of infrastructure, employment, jobs, housing and other benefits. And I think we need to connect the dots here across these different conversations and to make sure that we're looking at the role that non-state actors can play, as well as local development trusts, community landowners and local authorities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now go to Wendy, then Artemis.
Hi. Some of my points have already been made. I think, yes, the third sector could deliver more services. And one of the issues, obviously, we would have is the scale. So it's about, we can't, similar to what we did with the NHS, we can do smaller things potentially, but we couldn't take on a whole service. So that has to be considered because we don't have the capacity with the people. Funding is the biggest issue around multi-year funding, not cutting the funding for the third sector when finances get tight. And I think somebody already mentioned about that feeling of keeping things and keeping services within the public sector. Making sure that we are having full cost recovery, because that can be an issue. We can't, in the third sector, always offer the benefits and the salaries that the public sector offer, which can be quite an issue. And I think it's just that remembering that the voluntary sector is not it's not free. Volunteers are not free. And we have a limited capacity within different areas as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Artemis, and then Kirsty.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you very much, Paul, for the answer. Scottish Rural Action, without repeating what everybody else has said, would agree wholeheartedly with what Juliana said, that the answer to your question is genuine partnership between government and communities. We would agree with what Alan and Megan and Wendy and others have said, that it's about local democracy and about promoting community wealth building. And the final point that we would want to make is that it is really important that we're having this conversation in this committee room when we're focusing on human rights, because the language of human rights is a very powerful one that can bind communities and government in shared action. It can do, as Alan said, it can be the vehicle for reimagining that future, or as Megan said, it can be the vehicle for connecting the dots. Just last month, very quickly, Scottish Rural Action delivered the 6th European Rural Parliament, which took place in Aberdeenshire in partnership with the Scottish Government, Community Land Scotland, lots of different organisations. It saw 400 people come from 40 different European countries to Scotland to learn from us. One thing the Europeans brought was a lot of discussion around the right to stay, which is recently embedded in the new Commission, so the European Commission's rather than the SHRC's rural policy agenda. It's linked to the rights mainly of young people to live and work and, you know, have an education and a future in the places that they grew up, and it enables succession planning, it stems to population. These are the aims. It is a bit of a catch-all right, but it's also put into practice. So just last week, there was an announcement by the Commission that there would be a 10% rural protection in the EU's budget linked specifically to this right to stay. Now, I think in Scotland, we would probably have a debate as to whether we would focus on the right to stay or whether it'd be a broader right to mobility in the country. But these are all really, really healthy conversations to be had in the context of human rights. And as I said, it is really about creating that positive platform for dialogue, meaningful dialogue between communities and between government based on a shared vision.
Okay, thank you. Now go to Kirsty, please.
I promise to keep it really brief. That's okay. I think, yeah, you've all covered it. The importance of collaborative working is huge. We all need to work together, but to do that, the third sector needs to have an equal seat at that table. I think, Juliana, you said those exact words, that needs to be listened to, so you can allow things to happen upstream rather than the traditional sort of downstream of when things start to go wrong, and often that's when it kind of ends up kicking in. Also, when we're looking at communities and giving communities power and allowing communities to do, that's who's got the vested interest. Communities want to make their communities better, they want to improve, so they're the experts on those areas, and we need to use them. And you know, the Highlands is the best example. We love to use the size of Belgium, as we talk about that a lot, but it's different all across the different areas, and they've all got different traditions, different things, different even climates within it they need to look at. So yeah, but how do you do that? We need to support these people, be that through education, and also sadly you're always going to need a bit of money that comes in too. But if you can put that education and that support in, then often these communities will just flourish and they stop needing it and they can then go on their own. So it's coming in at that base level. But yeah, big one for me is the equal seat at the table.
Okay.
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you. I'll have Sheena, then Alistair, please.
Okay, thank you. Very, very briefly, because, you know, folk had said what I was going to say, but totally agree, a multi-agency partnership approach, equality, you know, being there at the table as an equal partner, because there is a huge reliance on the third sector to deliver services. So why not, why shouldn't we be there at the formation and planning level as well? Because often the third sector have a valuable insight into what the needs of the community are at grassroots level, you know, delivering care, transport services, mental health support services. So have a real insight into the needs of the community. So our contribution is vital, and, you know, it shouldn't just be piecemeal. It has to be a collaborative approach. So definitely, you know, it is a multi-agency, agency disciplinary approach, you know, for the benefits. You know, at the end of the day, it's to benefit our population. So collaboration is required. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Alistair, please.
Thanks. My point has generally been made, but there's no harm in absolutely hammering it home. The participation of communities has got to be meaningful, and it's got to be at the heart of everything that happens. What we see is piecemeal consultations and engagement exercises that just don't even touch the sides. The participation of communities has got to be meaningful.
That's great. Thank you so much. We're now going... Are you satisfied, Paul? Yep. Thank you. We'll now move on to questions from Maggie Chapman, please.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, and thank you for your comments so far. I'm going to focus on issues of employment and social security, and I suppose some of the barriers to employment you've already talked about around transport and that kind of thing, so we don't need to go over those again. But there are key challenges, I think, for rural communities in terms of employment, accessing support into employment. I'd be interested in your perspectives on how we can navigate around those barriers, if indeed that's at all possible. I don't know who wants to pick this up first.
Any indications?
Probably all want to go for it.
I'm sorry for keep going.
No, that's fine.
That's a very important topic, and I think when you think about the three grand challenges that rural communities face, I'm thinking about Scottish Borders, obviously, in terms of transport, the economic disadvantage, and overall the impact of life chances on people.
Yeah.
We think about employment as a way out of poverty. Now, in the Scottish Borders, 1 in every 4 children are in poverty, and around 16% of the population rely on universal credit. There are challenges. We mentioned transport as key. One of them in the Scottish Borders rural communities, we have the employers are mainly small businesses, and they are very spread. There is an element as well, an issue in terms of equality in the system. So childcare is a significant issue in rural communities, and the cost, but also the provision of childcare when it's available is the cost. Now, by default, those elements push women out of the market, the labour market, and career progression, driving families into further poverty. So it seems to be that feedback loop of poverty, lack of transport, lack of skills to do the job. Women tend to be unpaid carers as well in rural communities like the Scottish Borders. And on top of that, then we talk about repopulation. So we're losing our young workforce to urban areas where employment is more attractive, opportunities for learning and skills development are easier to access. I think that is, for us, there's a need to look at the context that contributes to poverty, isolation, and lack of opportunities for sustainable employment. While we don't look at the wider issues, it makes it very difficult to address the challenges. Another statistics that, in terms of, I mentioned earlier, Scottish Borders being ahead of the curve in terms of the aging population, there is a prediction that between 2018, that's already started, all the way to 2028, there will be an increase in immigration to counterbalance the loss of population. But with that, it needs resourcing, again, it needs employment opportunities for people, housing we've already mentioned. So at the moment, it feels a little bit piecemeal when we start addressing challenges. Local initiatives for employment and skills development, hyper-local, and I'm going to mention the value of local-based approaches and accessibility to services. My own experience as somebody from an ethnic minority background, for my own learning journey, my journey started as an ESOL class in the local community centre. So if we're talking about relying on immigration to counterbalance the loss of population, those provisions need to be in place at a very hyper-local level. I've managed to progress into succession and achieving a master's degree, but that journey started at a very local level. While we remove those provisions, it makes it very difficult for entrepreneurial mindsets in local communities, ambition that comes with understanding the value, and again, I'm not going to mention, it's already been mentioned, the infrastructure that's needed around that. In rural communities, I would like to see more investment into enterprising, into supporting women back to work, into childcare and care overall, roles and responsibilities, and absolutely a need for investment into enterprising models beyond the traditional pathway to college and further education. And absolutely that's also needed, but apprenticeships for young people so they can start earning, because rural communities need to earn so they can survive. We've addressed the challenge of cost of living in rural areas. And then to continuing employment and further opportunities, that needs to be counterbalanced. I must just mention that the Scottish Borders is one of the lowest age economy in Scotland. And on average, the Scottish Borders worker has less than £50 compared to urban areas a week, and that's a weekly impact on wages. So all those challenges need to be considered. People do need to move into employment, and there needs to be a thinking beyond the traditional pathways for skills development and working opportunities.
Thanks very much for that. And I think that it links into what Paul was talking about, capacity building, but also broader cost of living issues. You know, if cost of living is higher, then those support services don't go as far. I know Alan wanted to come in as well.
Thank you, and thanks for the question. Yeah, I would agree with the points my colleague has made. I suppose there are two particular factors to me: is either access the work that's already, work and jobs that's already available from rural communities, or you need to create more opportunities. I think the cost of living is a hugely important factor. We have in Dumfries and Galloway a particular low wage economy. We have a higher and increasing cost of living. So the Citizen Advice Service, helpful every 4 or 5 years, do a practical travel, shop, go round, what are the actual cost of buying goods. There's 125% difference between the cheapest basket of shopping in a town versus a more rural store. And if you don't have the transport, either cost or accessibility, then you don't really have a choice either. Many people in communities are just looking enough to live comfortably. We're not looking for necessarily anything hugely aspirational to travel the world per se. And I think that comes back to the point, therefore, about the creation of the opportunities, and I think there's limited focus, or not enough, let's say, in rural communities about building local economies. We're very regionalised or national when we look at the economic picture, but we don't necessarily invest enough time about the sustainability and building of local economies which can create jobs and use the skills that are already within the community, which I think is a significant gap. The second area is around being able to access to work. As Julianne has mentioned, there are lots of barriers around transport, cost of childcare and so on for people to take on opportunities. But we have a significant issue again in Dumfries and Galloway about our digital connectivity. It's not good enough, and we know it's not good enough. The Third Sector Dumfries and Galloway commissioned its own work in 2021 to understand the real community level needs. We have a very succinct action plan that we're all signed up to, but we're not able to deliver the actions because the investment, the national investment in digital development, has been shrinking year on year since that report was actually produced. And we also know our connectivity isn't great. So even if we had the digital skills and they had the motivation to do that, the download speeds in Dumfries and Galloway, very interestingly, are half that of the Scottish and UK average, for example. So the reliability of good internet connection isn't there in the first place. And in all 5 indicators that are present about what good connectivity looks like that the UK Parliament keeps up to date in terms of our position, in Dumfries and Galloway, every area is either in the bottom 30 or bottom worst 10% performing areas across the UK. So my point is we need to focus on creating the local opportunities with local economies, and if we want people to be able to access something much wider, we need to do something about our digital connection too.
Can I just, Alan, from your point of view, is there anything in the social security space that you would highlight in terms of either access to support? You mentioned citizens' advice support. Are those particular challenges that you think are distinct for your area?
Yeah, I think the availability and accessibility of advice and independent advice is hugely important. I think we do have a good enough coverage. I think it's reaching people who don't maybe understand that they should have access to it and they're eligible to it, to access that. And therefore, I think we need to be even more proactive in our independent advice services. We do know from Dumfries and Galloway Citizen Advice and other advice services, but they bring, I think the latest number for last year is about £9 million was actually through their advice was brought back into local economies, into households, which is hugely important. It could probably be more, because it's relying on those people to ask for the help in the first place. And unfortunately, we're currently facing the situation of a proposal locally to dismantle the funding for those services, which isn't helpful at all. So I think there's never a real sense of understanding what you're entitled to, the consistency of support to get that across rural communities. I think we try very hard in the Dumfries and Galloway to do that, but there are undoubtedly gaps. And if you don't have that, then your resources and help to then look for work or develop skills are therefore limited because you're only focused on living today.
Tiny little bits, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have Lewis and then Kirsty.
Yes.
Thank you, Maggie. I think it's a really important question, and I want to split the issue of employment into two parts. One, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are parts of rural Scotland that there is ample employment opportunities, but then there is insufficient housing to actually be able to take up those opportunities. If you were to open the Orcadian on any given day or any given week, you will find dozens and dozens of employment opportunities, some well-paid employment opportunities, either through the NHS or Orkney Islands Council. There's just nowhere to live if you take any of those opportunities. And you hear anecdotes over and over that people do take them, move to Orkney for a couple of weeks, for example, and then have to resign because they can't find anywhere to live. So there are parts of Scotland where there is ample employment opportunities, but the infrastructure, and that could be childcare, that could be housing or something else, is not there to support those employments. And then there is a different picture of part of rural Scotland where there is not sufficient employment. That often can be, as Alan was saying, lack of digital connectivity. So you might want to be able to work from there, but there's no ability to do that. And there has been really good proposals from Community Development Trust, for example, saying, why don't we transform the village hub into a digital hub where we could invest into putting the money there, not into every single house, and people can work from there, things like that. And that, unfortunately, hasn't been sufficiently funded. And then there is also, and I think we think about this less, there is also centralisation of employment, not just services. So employment that could work anywhere else in Scotland is suddenly only in Edinburgh or Glasgow, or employment that could be anywhere in Highland Council, but it is in Inverness. And so how much are there strong commitments from both national government and local authorities to put jobs back? We've said, at the Commission, we said, why isn't there an island team based on an island, for example? If we have an island department of the Scottish Government, why is that not based on an island? Why don't we have part of the work of the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs based on rural Scotland? So there is incentives that could be done to bring back employment into the communities that have really have been redrawn and moved into central urban areas.
And I suppose, and Tess will be familiar with this as well, where there are job opportunities, maybe there's the housing, but there's no local school because it's a family who's moved into that. So, yeah, having to look at this in the round. Sorry, Karen, you wanted this one.
Kirsty and then Sheena.
So, in terms of employment barriers, I think we've talked about so many today with all the discussions. Yeah, you know, your example of housing, we hear it all the time. Oh, we need a new teacher at this school and there's nowhere for them to live, and they're in an Airbnb and there's the adverts that go up, is there anywhere to put them? So you can't get trained people. Also, even down at a real basic level, if you're a teenager and you work in the outskirts of Inverness and you want to take on a weekend job, say working in one of the shops, like you can't get a bus in to come to work on a Sunday at that, you know, first basic level. One of the big problems that we have is actually sometimes filling roles. Hospitality, huge issue. People used to come over from abroad to work and they can't come anymore, and we massively miss them. Social care, it's paid dismally for what the role that people do. You know, people that work in social care, you have any experience, they are just absolute angels and go above and beyond, and they don't get paid well. And if you are a working mum, say, and you want to go and have a career in social care, well, you won't earn enough to pay the childcare that it costs, and that's if you live in somewhere that actually has childcare. So then you're into the being at the beck and call of maybe a local childminder who isn't always available. And we've got a couple of charities that do some great work with childcare in the Highlands, one called Cala. And one of their big bugbears is that a lot of communities come together and they say, right, we're going to create something in the village hall, we're going to have, and then they haven't got the right infrastructure. So there's not the right nappy changing area in the set area. So they have the rules and the hoops they can't jump through to allow them to do that. So sometimes it's just having that little bit of flexibility to allow people, or even within the social care world, looking at how you can manage it to still get people working, but also just looking at the base levels they pay. It's really, really expensive to live in some rural areas. We've talked about houses that are not insulated. We've talked about the cost of heating. We pay more in fuel bills up there than we do in other parts, which is, you know, than you do down in London. So it's criminal. But on a more positive side, the Highlands, in terms of as an area, there's a lot of work coming its way, especially within the sort of world of engineering. We've got the Green Free Port, we're building all the huge pylons, which is upsetting, obviously, a lot of people, but they're coming, which is going to bring in lots. And I know the local colleges and universities are already looking at how to train people. The worry is the aftermath. So are we going to have lots of people brought in that do all this great work, and then what are they going to do afterwards when they've set up? So that's one of the other concerns.
Okay, thank you. We'll have Sheena, then Alistair.
Hey, thank you. Just following on, a lack of childcare is a massive barrier to accessing employment opportunities. So as we heard, it's not just housing, childcare is massive, and it has a direct impact, on the economy, employability and on human rights. Because childcare policies and frameworks really need to have a rural and island lens in order to allow services to run in these extreme rural settings. It can't be one framework fits all, because there needs to be a budget, I think, for rural childcare facilities, because often it's impossible to have a steady flow of numbers of children through the doors. So, for example, in US, there's no independent childminder anymore due to it not being financially sustainable. There's no subsidy support when the numbers maybe are low. Again, so a good practice that in 2024, a multi-agency Youth and Barra Childcare Forum was created, and working alongside other partners to proactively address the challenges around childcare within the islands, and working closely in partnership with local and national agencies as well as local and national government. Obviously communities know best what the needs are, but real investment is required at government level to come up with solutions. So it is about working together, that approach. So really it's continuing to work with local providers and experts to work and to invest at a national level. So it's about the working relationships, but also about investing money in. And as I said, it's not a one size fits all. So there's a plea there, please, to work together with our local communities to come up with sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alistair, please.
Thanks very much. I'm going to pick up on your point about social security, Maggie. Why in the 21st century do we have a system that is so complicated that people don't understand what they're entitled to, that at a time when you really, really need support, you're faced with a system that's bamboozling? But employers don't understand the social security system either. They don't understand why people might not want to take on more hours, because they might then lose out on part of their entitlements. Employers possibly don't also get how difficult it is to start a job at 6 o'clock in the morning or work till 10 o'clock at night in a rural area because you can't get there or get home, or you have no one to look after your kids. But the system doesn't need to be this complicated. The amount of resources that we're putting in to helping people navigate the system is getting unsustainable.
Okay, thank you. Is there any more indications coming on this point? If not, we'll move on to our final question from Pam Gossel, please.
Thank you, Convener. The protection of women and girls, especially those fleeing from domestic abuse, has been one of my top priorities since I've come into the Parliament. Earlier this year, we heard from committee, we took evidence in this committee on access to civil legal aid and the barriers many survivors of domestic abuse face in accessing such aid, especially in the rural areas. Witnesses spoke of legal aid deserts, meaning geographic areas where it is difficult to find a legal aid solicitor. We heard the shocking example of a Highland woman who had contacted 116 legal aid lawyers regarding her divorce case. And in some cases, in small communities where everyone knows each other, many survivors fear seeking legal advice as the solicitors are acquainted with the perpetrators sometimes. So how can these changes be addressed through community organisations and by the Scottish Government? Who would like to go on that?
Any indications, Lewis?
I can start with that. I think a couple of things. First, to draw back the work that we've done on access to justice and the map that we produced of where advice centres are located in Scotland. And that includes for victims of domestic violence, but also for social security, following up on Maggie's questions, and other areas. And so what we see is a very clear a very graphic representation of where the advice centres are and where they are concentrated, which of course is where most of the population are, which is in the Central Belt, and where there are areas where there is little to no advice centre. So I think the starting point before going to legal aid is where do you get advice and what type of advice can you get from? So for the whole of Sutherland, that would only be, for example, the advice centre would be in Kinglochbervie. That might be a 2 or 3 hour drive just to receive advice. I think that's the starting point. Then there are other layers that make, in general, seeking advice and complaining both on sexual violence, domestic abuse and any other human rights issue very difficult for some communities, either because of stigma, either because of who might the perpetrator be, how the information is used or abused. We've heard concerns in different rural communities of how maybe the local press, for example, might use the information. There are other policies in relation, for good reasons, of how evidence might be gathered, or how, if you are a victim of sexual abuse, you might have to travel in the conditions that you've been abused, in the clothes you've been abused, back to Glasgow or Edinburgh, take a ferry, because the system is not placed to be able to take and gather that evidence there. So, I mean, we have a system of layers up to the point that we actually get to legal aid, which is another general crisis that we're seeing. So I think it's just important to see the kind of different components in which victims of sexual abuse might find themselves, and how then we see little reporting in general across the country, but particularly for rural areas, there will be a higher degree of barrier in which many people might not feel comfortable enough to really come out and say so.
Just on that, sorry, Dr. Lewis, I wanted to probe a little bit more. So what do you think communities or the Scottish Government should be doing about this?
Well, I would probably start by, I mean, there's a good amount of work from various rape crisis groups across all of Scotland that have indicated some of the policy solutions. It might differ in each area, because in some islands, in some rural communities, there might be better access to than in others. So it will depend on that. So it would have to be a really careful reflection of what is the problem in each community and what is a potential solution in each community. I don't think, for me, it would be probably appropriate to say a wide range of what the solution would be. But I think what is missing is how much some of the communities, some of the women's groups, some of the rape crisis group feel that their concerns or their potential solutions have really been heard. What has been said to me is that they feel they haven't. What have been said to me is that some of the policy solutions that they've recommended have not been implemented. So I think there would be a need for a deeper dive into what potentially could be implemented, both from Police Scotland all the way to wider reform in our legal aid and our criminal justice system.
Okay, no, thank you for that.
Alan, yeah.
Thanks, and I would agree with Lewis' position in terms of advice service. He's less close to legal aid position, but in Dumfries and Galloway, the vast majority of support services are provided by community and voluntary organisations. All of our data and insights about experience about women and girls comes from community and voluntary organisations. It's probably fair to say that the best people who understand how to respond to that need, the needs for the advice, the ongoing support, will come from those organisations and do come from those organisations themselves. I know we're back to the foundations, but operating that kind of essential service, not just in responding to the needs of women and girls in a really considerate and compassionate way, but the proactive work they do in schools and with young people around understanding violence against women and girls and try to tackle it up front, it has nowhere near the investment that's needed. The sustainability of our services, and I think it happens across rural areas, but particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, seems always at threat, when in fact what women and girls need is that trusted place, the long-term relationships, a place to go and to go back to when you need it. It's not a moment in time necessarily, and we don't give the level of security and certainty to those services to be available all the time, and therefore they spend a lot of their time finding the resources to maintain themselves. Now, all of the information that's used across our public services about the access to services and the reporting of services, it comes directly from the sector. And I guess on a fundamental level for me, we don't pay for that. This is a significant kind of societal investment for me. It's just not operating a service. Violence against women and girls is a huge issue for our society, and we need to see it as such and therefore give that level of investment. So, as Lewis said, less close to the kind of legal aid, but I think the foundational being able to access in a really dignified and a humane way when you need it, the advice and support services is hugely important, and I don't think we've got that right yet, when you get to the really kind of complex legal position.
Just on that, Alan, I've been speaking to many, quite a lot actually, over the last 3 years, domestic abuse organisations that, be it like Women's Aid and other organisations, especially a lot in the rural areas. Over the summer I spoke to many, and one of the things they had said, touched on, is what you've just said about the actual service to have the right funding. Now, they feel that they might get, this year, this amount of money, and then that's it. But there's people working for them, and obviously there's people out there that really need that help as well, those women and girls, and they feel that there's no long-term planning, so they need that multi-year funding. So do you think that's something that could help, having that secure, sustainability, that the fact that, you've got 3 years funding there, that it can help? Do you think that's something?
Absolutely, and even 3 years isn't enough. As I said, I think our position is it's not just like any other service. This is a societal issue that's not going away tomorrow. So to be an annualised funding for services, and also patchwork of funding, some for outreach, a little bit for doing housing support, a little bit for doing service provision, and these are quite specialist situations, quite specialist roles, as I said, that rely on building trust and relationships. They're not something that you can switch on and off overnight. And I think the fact that the services like those responding to the needs of women and girls and others that have to come up to into their last months of the financial year and hope they're going to be able to keep the people in support, the women and girls that they are, I think isn't acceptable. So almost you could put a lot into that category, but I think feeling quite passionate about this, that, as I said, this is a societal issue. We should be committing already on a decade-long investment for these services that are needed. And, as I said, the proactive work, not just the responsiveness to women and girls, but the proactive work that's needed for young people too.
No, thank you.
Okay, we'll have Artemis would like to come in on this, please.
Thank you. And I just want to say I completely agree with everything that Alan has just talked about. The women's aid services, which are at the front line of supporting women and children affected by gender-based violence alongside rape crisis services, they are so incredibly stretched at the moment, and they have been for decades. And each women's aid service within a rural area might cover a smaller population number than, say, in an urban centre, but the geographical coverage that they need to work to is absolutely vast. And what this means in practice is that you have very proactive organisations, exactly as Alan says, that meticulously collect the data that we need as Scotland, really, to begin seriously addressing this issue. And yet they're so deep inside that service provision a priority that it's very, very difficult for them to come together and collect that data that they have, that expertise, and feed it into policy. And when they do, they're doing it from a very rural perspective that frequently gets lost in the national picture. So I think one of the things that this committee can do is perhaps host a meeting specifically for rural women's aid and rural rape crisis and rural gender-based violence organisations and listen to them in that, give them that time and platform their views.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Juliana.
Just to make a quick observation, because this discussion goes back to Paul's question about who's best to deliver services. This is a very clear example that best to deliver services are local, embedded third sector organisations such as Women's Aid and Rape Crisis, embedded in communities. The cost of delivering these services are high, and absolutely in terms of comparison to savings in public service, it's nothing. So we need to recognise that, and I think more than anything else, if we don't invest in them, we will see eventually crisis intervention in terms of health and social care, and it's a false economy not investing in the services, and I think that needs to be noted.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, that brings us to a close this morning. Thank you all so much for taking part in this discussion. We've gained a lot from it, and we were going to take what we've learned this week and last week and put that to the Minister for Equalities at next week's meeting. So that concludes our formal business in public. We will close and discuss the final items on our agenda in private. Thank you.